All right, I know there are still a couple of folks joining. So once again, you can see us, but we can't see you, but you are an important part of the conversation this morning. So we hope that you will go ahead and join us in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout this conversation. And of course, we want to get to your questions and understand what it is that the audience is most interested in learning about today. So if you want to say hi in the chat and let us know what you're interested in learning about this morning, it's always nice to see people's names and their conversation as well. So we'll make sure to get to as many audience questions as we can this morning. So again, just a moment longer before we start, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning for this online forum on addiction and housing. And we will get started in just one more moment. If you are just joining us, feel free to pop into the chat and say hello. Introduce yourself to your friends so they all know that you're here. Ask any questions that might be already burning in your mind, and we will go ahead and get to those during this conversation. We are recording this webinar and we will share this link for later. So if you are not able to join us for the entire conversation, we will be sure to share this later. And so nice to see so many people joining us in the chat. If you want to share something with the entire audience, make sure to send it to the attendees as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this online forum on addiction and housing. My name is Serena Unrein, and I am with the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities. And we are so pleased to co-host this important discussion this morning with the Arizona Housing Coalition. And we are joined by 3 expert panelists who are going to be sharing their thoughts on substance use disorders and the connection to housing, and how we can best find equitable, supportive services to pair with housing to support people who are in recovery. A few things to note before we get into this conversation shortly. You can see us, but we cannot see you. But you are an important part of this conversation. So we hope that you will go ahead and pop your questions into the chat like so many people are already doing. So thank you for already sharing some great questions. We'll be sure to get to those throughout the conversation. And we just want you to know that you are a very important part of this discussion. We will be recording this forum and sending the link to everyone who registered for this event, so you can share this with friends and colleagues or revisit this conversation. I'll now have our 3 panelists introduce themselves. If you joined us for our mental health and housing forum, you will see a returning face. So we'll start with Stefanie, and if you'd like to introduce yourself, that would be a great way to get this Wednesday started.
Thanks, Serena. Good morning, everybody. My name is Stefanie Smith. I am from Native American Connections. I have been with NAC for about 8 years now, and I am the supportive housing supervisor. At Native American Connections, we have inpatient and outpatient behavioral health services, as well as about 1,000 units of housing. About 350 of those units are project-based permanent supportive housing, which is what I oversee, and that will be the angle that I'm coming from today as a housing provider.
Thanks so much for agreeing to join us again, Stefanie. John, would you like to introduce yourself? Sorry.
Good morning, I'm John Abarca. I'm the Director of Program Operations for Community Bridges here in Yuma. And in Yuma, we provide integrated behavioral health services. We have an OTP clinic, which is the medication assisted treatment or MAT services. We also have a residential program that we cover, but we also provide a plethora of services around the state, including some housing services.
Great, so glad you could join us this morning, John. And last but not least, Nathan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Truitt, and I'm an outreach worker for Oxford Houses Incorporated. We are a nonprofit recovery housing organization here in Arizona and across the country.
Great. We're looking forward to hearing more from each of you about the work that you're doing and your organization. So we'll get started with the first question, just to kind of dip our toe into the water here. What role does housing play for people with substance use disorders? And I'd love to hear from each of you about your perspectives on this. And Nathan, maybe we'll start with you since we'll go in reverse order here.
No problem. So if you really think about it, stable housing is a fundamental need for all people, but it's especially more true for individuals with substance use disorder. It's extremely difficult to address someone's substance use disorder if they don't have a safe place to live. To kind of like put it in perspective, imagine someone getting out of treatment. They already have the stresses of, finding a job, braving the world, trying to stay clean, managing a lot of the responsibilities that they neglected during active use and beginning to rebuild their lives. And just imagine them coming out of treatment and not having somewhere safe to live, right? Or going back to the environment that they used to use in or used to drink in. The chances of them being able to juggle all that and stay clean are significantly lower. And to kind of put a face to that, that was me. I'm a person in long-term recovery. My clean date is September 30th, 2017. I came out of treatment. I didn't have the resources readily available to me to go into housing. So I went back to the environment that I was used to. And I relapsed. It took about 30 days and I went right back to the same ways. And I was doing the things in recovery that, I was taught in treatment. I was going to meetings, I was using self-help groups, I was attending IOP. But the environment that I was in was not conducive to the lifestyle I was trying to live. So someone reached out to me with Oxford House, and I've been clean since that date. So for me, from a personal aspect, housing is pretty much the number one important thing. Like if you don't have somewhere safe to live, it is almost impossible to stay clean. You have to be in a supportive environment that's conducive to the lifestyle you're trying to live. So to provide housing for people with substance use disorders is extremely important.
Wow, that's a really powerful example, and thank you for being willing to share that and get this whole conversation started. John, do you want to share a little bit about community bridges and your perspective?
Absolutely. Kind of in agreement with Nathan here. Housing has to be that one of the first steps that you really have to find for somebody in order for them to really be successful in their recovery. From a treatment provider, we see that those individuals that are either homeless or don't have stable housing do not as well as other individuals who do have that available to them. We see them miss appointments. We see them not available to be tracked down or to follow up with medications. We see their physical health affected. So having that foundation to really build from becomes very important. From my world, I'm from a fire emergency services background prior to this. And again, we saw these individuals on a regular basis. These were the ones that we were our frequent flyers, we would call them, because we saw them regularly. They're dealing with just survival for the most part. And so you try to add that layer of dealing with their addiction or their physical health or their mental health needs. And it just becomes impossible for them to be successful without having that foundation to really stand on.
Well, and what an interesting perspective to have seen that from an emergency services lens as well. And of course, Stefanie, we'd love to hear your perspective on the role that housing plays for people with substance use disorders and how you've seen that come into play at Native American Connections.
Of course, well, I agree with both Nathan and John that housing is fundamental. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, housing is towards the bottom. You need safe, stable shelter, right? Once you have your basic needs met, we can expand on that. So I always keep that in mind on, the way that people are participating in their lives is very important or very connected to their stable housing. From a housing provider's perspective, I think it's really important for support workers who are going and doing the home visits know what they're looking for to hopefully get ahead of any kind of downward spiral that might happen without, an early intervention. So I think it's really important for support workers, to know what to look for when they're doing a home visit, right? So looking for paraphernalia, knowing what paraphernalia looks like, what it might be, different things that are used for paraphernalia that you might not even know about, changes in the appearance of the apartment, changes in the person's physical appearance is all very important. And that also goes along with, are they making their appointments? Are they going to meetings? Are they doing all of the things that we know will help people maintain sobriety? And I think that's also important to know about and to get ahead of the game, because it can prevent eviction. So we know that if people's substance use gets out of hand, their behavior gets out of hand, that can definitely lead to eviction, which is not going to help anybody in any aspect of their life if they lose their housing. So it's not just addiction that we're thinking about with that, but just their overall functioning is going to be impacted if they lose their housing. So to all the people out there doing home visits and seeing people in the community, I think it's really important to always keep eyes and ears open and manage those behaviors. That way your client's not losing their housing. I'm sorry, I have an automatic light that keeps going on and off.
It's just the special effects that we've added for this particular conversation to put you in the spotlight. We've already had a few questions come in, and thank you for everyone who's been popping into the chat. And Nathan, one question that we had come in was, when someone reached out to you from Oxford House, how did they start the conversation, and how did they gain your trust?
This person I actually was in treatment with and had left treatment and went into an Oxford House. And they saw that I stopped going to meetings, and they ended up reaching out to me. But basically, when it all boils down to is she reached out and she says, I have a better option for you. She was like, you don't have to live that lifestyle anymore. And I know that housing, like not having somewhere safe to live, was an important reason or important part of why, I was not successful in my recovery. And we have a solution. It was really just about seeing like the light at the end of the tunnel and being able to see that it was working for somebody else.
That's amazing. And I would you like to share a little bit more about the model of Oxford House and what your plans in Arizona have been? Because I think that what you're doing is really fascinating and people might not be familiar with it. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more.
Yes. So we are, like I said, we're a nonprofit organization of recovery housing. Our model is basically centered on our houses are ran 100% democratically. So we don't have house managers. The houses are pretty much ran with rotating leadership of the members that are living in that house. So everything that they decide on in the house, as far as holding people accountable to the behaviors, who they accept in, who they expel out of the house, is all done in the democratic process, all done through a vote. So it gives people, when they come in, instantly a voice and a say in what's going on in their living environment. And then it creates a home environment. It's a little bit different than, if you were to go into, another type of recovery housing where, you have a house manager, you have somebody who's telling you what to do. It's in a boss, when you come into an Oxford House, you're coming into a home. So in Arizona, we got out here, and I'll go over a little bit this more in the slides that I have towards the end. But we got out here in 2019. We opened our first house in July, and I believe we were at 49 houses statewide, spread all the way from up north in Flagstaff all the way down to Yuma.
Wow, so you literally cover the entire state.
Yes.
That's great. And we also had a question come in for John. And John, one of the audience members wanted to know, when have you seen frequent flyers turn the corner, and how do they get the foundation to make that turn?
I don't think that there's a silver bullet, that one thing that will change everything for an individual. It has to be kind of a combination of meeting all of their needs. It has to be a holistic approach. And that's usually when we see those frequent flyers really turn the corner, is when we're able to connect services that ensure that they get their needs met. Whether, again, starting with housing, having somewhere where we can find them, we can follow up with them, we can make sure that they're receiving the services that they need. I used to work for a food bank also, so being able to meet their food needs, being able to and engage their medical needs, their mental health needs, connecting them with their families, again, establishing that foundation with those key intimate relationships in their life. So it's kind of a whole holistic approach that really ensures that we're able to get somebody from that frequent flyer status to somebody that becomes healthy.
What a great example of how all of these things are interconnected, and that these social determinants of health are all a factor in our well-being, and it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution. And I'd love to have us dig in a little bit more to talk about what some of those supportive services look like. And I know Native American Connections has done a fantastic job of having those kind of wraparound services. So Stefanie, if you'd like to talk about what NAC has done and some of the things that you think have really worked in your housing complexes, I think that you all are such a great example. So I'd love to turn it over to you.
Sure. One thing that we are fortunate to have in-house is treatment. And of course, if any resident wants to seek treatment, we've established an in-house priority so we can fast track people into our own treatment options. But of course, people have option, and we're not going to tell them that NAC is the only place that they can get treatment. We'll definitely support that anywhere they want to go. One thing that I think is really cool too is that we do have residents who are in long-term recovery, very involved in 12-step programs, where they have created their own AA meetings or NA meetings on our properties that are completely started, ran, and supported by them, and they are all open meetings. So we have people from outside the apartment community coming to meetings on our properties as well. Well, pre-COVID, we did. It's kind of hard with COVID. But those people are still, the ones who are at the property that were participating in the meeting, we are still seeing them get together, so there might just be a group of maybe 4 or 5 of them, where they can get together and have a small meeting, or maybe, they'll do some step work or something like that. One thing that I think is really cool too is once COVID happened, all in-person services stopped for a while. And for our residents, that was a huge change. There's very much a routine in going to doctor's appointments, or if they have a serious mental illness, they're going to the SMI clinic, and all of that was paused, and we had to help them navigate that of what it looks like to go to a doctor's appointment, getting their meds refilled. Just all of that was completely new. And I think that is a place that we saw some disparities, because there was this major shift to telehealth for people that weren't used to participating in telehealth, and they didn't have a smartphone. If they did have a smartphone, they didn't know how to use Zoom or Google Duo, or any of the platforms. So one way that we responded to that is that we got an iPhone for every single one of our housing communities, and that iPhone was available to any resident at any time for any kind of appointment. And a lot of 12-step meetings switched to an online platform. So if somebody wanted to attend a virtual AA meeting in the evening, it's available to them for that as well. So that was one way that I thought was really cool, how we addressed that disparity to make sure that everybody still has access to care. And of course, we're still helping them, get to appointments, get their meds refilled through the pharmacy, whatever those challenges that we saw. We were just always being creative, thinking outside the box of, this is what's presenting in front of us. How can we help them navigate that while we're still learning ourselves how to figure out all of these changes, right? We didn't know this either, but we're just going to roll with it and figure it out and make sure that everybody's taken care of. Another thing that I thought was really cool, unrelated to addiction, but how many people started using grocery delivery through their phone too. I thought that was really neat to see people doing that and trusting technology a little bit more and seeing how it can work for them.
We sure are all trying to figure out things in this strange new world we're living in. And what an exciting example from NAC about how to try to bridge the gap in disparities and make sure that everyone has access to telehealth and other services. And John, I know when we were setting up for this conversation, you had some thoughts about how COVID has impacted our progress and impacted persons in recovery. And so I'll have you weigh in here. And Nathan, if you have any other thoughts as well on how COVID has impacted our progress. I think, of course, this is top of mind to a lot of people right now. So I'll have you get started, John.
Absolutely. So I think it has, one, across the board laid another layer of anxiety on kind of society as a whole. And so if you're an individual that's really struggling with addiction, it just adds another layer there that you're going to have to navigate and overcome. As treatment providers, one of the challenges that we had, again, was being able to encounter these individuals. Because again, if they're exposed to COVID or if they're afraid of being exposed to COVID, they're not coming into the clinic as much. They're avoiding sometimes the visits. Fortunately, we had a pretty strong telehealth presence in our services, and we've really built that up even more so in the last year. And I think that really has changed the paradigm for most of the treatment providers, really to become more flexible and become more available to your individuals that you're serving, because we can't become the obstacle that keeps individuals from engaging in the treatment and the services that they need. So we have to become more creative in the way that we're going to engage them. I think not coming from the behavioral health world, I had a little bit of an advantage because I had nothing invested in like, oh, this is the way we've done it forever. It was like, well, let's just try something different. And so we've had a lot of success in just really recreating ourselves in how we're engaging the individuals that need services from us. And I think that's really the key. And I think that's one of the benefits, I think, believe it or not, that I can say of COVID is that it kind of forced us into that that mindset of how do we get creative? How do we do things different? And instead of trying to kind of protect the system that we've created, really find a way, how do we engage the individuals that are out there? You know, my stump speech to my staff every day is, we have individuals that bring their life to us because they need help. They need us to step in and walk alongside them and support them. And we have to be able to meet them where they're at and how they're doing it, and in order to get them to the successful place that they are looking for, to meet the goals that they set for themselves.
That's incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing that stump speech with all of us.
And I know for us over at Oxford House, if you really think about it, COVID hit as a pandemic that definitely affected so many different areas of our lives. But the one thing it didn't change was the need for people to find, resources for recovery and housing. Those things did not change. That need was still there. So if you really look at it, we didn't slow down too terribly much with COVID. I mean, a majority of our growth here in the state of Arizona was done during the pandemic. Because we knew as an organization that provides housing for those coming into recovery, that they still needed a bed. They still needed somewhere safe to live if they wanted to be successful and grow in their recovery. We definitely had to get creative. You know what I mean? The way our interview process is normally they would come in person, sit down with the members of the house and interview. So, we had to get creative and start doing phone interviews and start doing Zoom. I really liked what Stefanie was talking about, how like so many people were not used to Zoom and didn't know how to use it. So it was a lot of teaching, a lot of education. But we were there to meet the challenge. We were holding Zoom recovery meetings. We had Zoom empowerment events for women, within our organization. So for us, it was just simple. We had to find a way to still provide housing for those coming out of treatment or those starting their recovery process, and how are we going to do it? And like I said, our most of our growth was during the pandemic. So.
Wow. I'm just so impressed by all of your organizations and your ability to not just keep going during this pandemic, but also to adapt and find ways to continue to serve people. I also wanted to say thank you to all of the audience members, not just for attending today, but for really being part of the conversation. We are getting a ton of really thoughtful questions in the chat, so please keep those coming. We will get to as many audience questions as we possibly can. And if we cannot get to all of them, we'll do our best to follow up after this conversation as well. And I wanted to go back to a couple of questions that we've had come in on sober living homes, because that's certainly been a topic of conversation in Arizona in recent years. And there are some new regulations for sober living homes, as one audience member pointed out. So what does that mean for sober living homes in Arizona? And if any of our panelists have some thoughts on that, I'd love for us to have a little bit of discussion, since it seems like this is a topic on the audience's mind. And Nathan, maybe I'll have you get started.
And I'm sorry, what was the topic of the question? What was the, the
No
new
problem.
regulation?
On what does that mean? What do the new regulations mean for sober living homes in Arizona?
So I am not too versed in this question, so I will deflect on that one. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Stefanie or John, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that topic either.
Not necessarily in the regulations, but I think on the sober living homes as a whole, we work pretty closely, and I saw a question a little bit earlier, how does that work with medication assisted treatment? And being a provider of MAT services, we do methadone, Suboxone, Vivitrol, and you know, the whole gamut of it. We ran into that kind of challenge because I think that you know, methadone for a long time had a really negative connotation to it, attached to it. People saw methadone, and you know, again, coming from the emergency services and working in the ERs and with that population, 20 years ago, I would look at somebody on methadone and roll my eyes and think, oh, you know, this is that kind of person. The reality is that the opiate epidemic also has affected our whole society, and there's no class of person that is affected by opiates. You know, we treat everything, again, I use that term, from soccer moms to professionals to, you know, your run-of-the-mill individual. So there is no, there's no more class of person that is on MAT services. And I think that that was driving a lot of the engagement when it came from some of the sober living homes, from some of the shelters. You know, I use the example, up until about 3-4 years ago, our drug court program here in Yuma wouldn't allow you into the drug court program if you were on MAT services. And so it took a lot of education on our part to really build those relationships and bring those people alongside with us and really work with them. You know, I can think about 3 or 4 different entities that we've had to do this whole process with to really make their services available to the populations that we're serving with MAT services. So I think that it's important that we work as a whole, that we get away from the idea that we're working in silos and this is my model, this is my thing that I'm doing, and realize that we have individuals. I like how Nathan said, especially during COVID, their needs don't change. Their needs don't change because I have a model to protect or I have a model to promote. That person still has a need to be met. And how do I work with everybody else? Because I know that I can't meet all of their needs. And so I have to work across, you know, boundaries with the other providers or other, you know, entities that can provide those needs for them to make sure that these individuals become successful. And again, ultimately reach those goals. I think that, again, the stump speech to my staff is that the number one thing that we have to believe in, we have to believe in the human potential. We have to believe that people can get better, that they can become successful, that they can be productive in society. And we don't write off people just because they you know, struggle with certain things that maybe I didn't struggle with. So I think that really becomes important in building those alliances with each other so that we can meet the needs of individuals, because no one of us can meet every need that individuals have.
I'm just really glad that we're recording this webinar so we can come back to those moments of believing in the human potential. And thank you for sharing those excellent points, John. We also had a question come in on housing first, and I know that Native American Connections has been really a leader in the housing first space. So Stefanie, do you want to talk a little bit about housing first? And make sure to let folks know what that is in case we have some people who aren't as familiar with it.
Definitely. I saw some questions about housing first and addressing behaviors in housing. So I'd definitely love to talk about that. Housing first is a model used that eliminates as many barriers as possible to get into housing. So people are not required to be clean and sober. People are not required to be bed compliant. It's really the idea that you house somebody first, meet them where they're at, and then once they're in housing, we're going to wrap services around. So for us, when we have people who are active in their substance use, that in and of itself does not violate a lease. It does not get them kicked out or evicted, whatever word you want to use. We focus a lot on managing behaviors. We definitely have some residents who are pretty regular substance users and they don't do it in their apartment. They go out and use, they come home, they go home, and they don't really draw attention to themselves. So there's not, like, that's not violating their lease, but as a case manager, we know that that's happening. We have that rapport with them, and they know that treatment is always on the table, and we will always connect them with that because we know there's stages of change and somebody might not be ready to make that change yet, and that's okay. We're going to make sure that they are as healthy and safe as they can be in their housing. We have other folks that might come home and cause a disruption. Maybe they punch a hole through the wall, and maybe they cuss out our staff. That's when we can be a little bit more aggressive with our approach and say, hey, you know, your use isn't, you know, so low key anymore. It's really affecting your housing. You can't come in and do this all the time. And we might be a little bit more aggressive in that way of you know, putting treatment on the table, but it's definitely not a one and done. We have people that have been in our housing for many years and they have had sobriety time, they have had relapses, and wherever they're at, we are going to be there and support them to make sure that they remain housed. One thing that we do that's not always the super popular thing that people do, but if people get a 10-day notice because they did something while they were under the influence, we will let them cure their 10-day notice by going to treatment. And we're not dictating that level of treatment. They can go to wherever they want to go, get an intake assessment done, and whatever the assessor says needs to be their level of treatment, we are okay with that. We will support them in that. We will make sure they have the iPhone to do IOP, bus passes to get there. Or if it's residential, of course, they go to treatment. They still have an apartment to return to no matter how long they've been in treatment, because that makes no sense to send somebody to treatment and then give up their apartment, right? So we do all of those things, and it's really, we want to keep people housed, and we really focus on the behavior aspect of that. And there's a really long thing in the chat that I've been trying to read, but I can't. So, and same with the MAT treatment that John kind of hit on. I mean, we're definitely supportive of that. And, you know, like, it would never be an issue, you know, for like people who have methadone, they can have take homes. Maybe they'll have weekend take homes or week long of their take home doses. Of course, that is like never an issue for us, that they can, you know, bring that home with them and have their medication at home either. I wanted to make sure we talked about that as well.
And thanks for bringing up all of that work that Native American Connections has done and your perspective as an organization, because I think, or I know that this wasn't, that you all were on the cutting edge, and sometimes that's a pretty scary place to be, and that you really were committed to making sure that people stayed housed regardless of their status in recovery. And I'm just so impressed by the organization's commitment to that. And John, I will turn it over to you again, because I remember that when we were talking before, that you were talking about that this isn't really about so much the use, but that that you're looking for what the underlying issue is, and that the use is really just a symptom. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, I found it fascinating.
And, you know, kind of tying into what Stefanie brought up a little while ago with, you know, they'll get the 10-day notice because they used, but is the fix really to evict them from housing because they used? Is that really going to get them where we want them to go? No. Ultimately, we got to find the underlying reason. And my perspective is that substance use is just a symptom of a lot of other stuff that can be going on in an individual's lives. And so our job becomes, how do we find that? How do we connect with them? How do we identify really the needs that they have, and then engage them to ensure that they're moving forward? And each individual's treatment is going to be unique. We can't do cookie cutter treatment. We can't do, well, you got to do this and you got to do this, and here's step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It has to be unique to the individual, and we have to make sure that their needs are being met. Ultimately, that's the role of treatment providers from my perspective. Again, going back to my stump speech to my staff, we have to meet their needs. We have to identify what is it that we can provide them. And if we can't provide it, then we need to find it. We need to identify who in the community, who out there can provide that need, because that's the only way we're going to get people to move forward. Using the MAT services. Yeah, we can use MAT. Some people may not like this, but methadone is not cure addiction. It's a tool that we use to get people from point A to point B. The fix, the real change is helping them become healthy in their mindset and their thinking and their relationships and their stability as a whole, as an individual. And then we can get people healthier. But yeah, I think that's a big, a lot of the questions that I've seen kind of in the chat here kind of are, what are the things that we can do? What are the, what's the initial step that we can take? A lot of it is really coming to that point that as an individual, as a human being, that person has more than just one need. They have a plethora of needs. And as treatment providers and as those individuals that are working to try to move this forward, we have to identify those needs for individuals and then find ways to fix those needs, to identify, to supply the resources, the skills, the education, the whatever it is that needs to happen to make sure that people can be successful and they can accomplish the goals that they set for themselves. Because I have yet to see somebody that comes into treatment that says, my goal is to continue to be an addict and continue to struggle with addiction, and that one day I want to die from this. That's not a goal of anybody that I've ever met in treatment. And do they struggle with it? Absolutely. They're human beings. And the reason they struggle is because it's human nature. We all struggle with different things. I kind of share with my patients, up until about 3-4 years ago, I weighed 320 pounds. I went from being a fireman to gaining over 120 pounds in a period of time frame. And I said, what's the difference with that? I knew that I was unhealthy. I just couldn't find the way to get healthy again. And over a period of about a year, I lost the weight again. And so I use that kind of with them to say, I may not be an addict in the sense of I use an illicit substance, but I struggled with issues in the same way. It's human behavior. We're all human. We all struggle, and we all need to find ways. How do we support each other to become better human beings?
Thanks for sharing, John. I know somebody had asked earlier about how to connect with clients if they haven't been in their shoes in terms of drug and alcohol abuse. And I think that's just a really powerful example, just to share that we're all human and we all have things that we struggle with. Nathan, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and shift back to Oxford House, because a number of people have chimed in the chat about just wanting to know a little bit more about Oxford House. And one person asked the question, how do you avoid drama in the house? And I am sure that other people are wondering the same thing. So if you would like to talk a little bit about that, I think people would be interested.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, if you really think about it, when you're putting drug addicts and alcoholics into a house together, you're not going to avoid drama. It's going to happen. But what's cool about our model and like the peer-to-peer support aspect of it is that our main focus in the house, of course, outside of staying clean and sober, is holding each other accountable, focusing on behaviors. And then as a collective group, we sit down and we discuss each other's behaviors and how can we fix it. Like I said before, drama is unavoidable, when in this kind of demographic of people. But being able to reach out a hand to someone and say, hey, like, I'm concerned for your behavior. I want to help you and I want to see you, be able to overcome it. How can I help? So having that peer-to-peer support is pretty crucial in our model to help kind of overcome that issue.
Thanks for sharing. I mean, I don't think that drama in a house is unique just in Oxford's house situation, right? We're all stuck inside our homes, and I can speak personally that I know there's, you know, no shortage of drama sometimes, right? So so it just makes sense to me that that's also true at Oxford House. So I wanted to talk a little bit about inequities, and we've done a nice job, I think the panelists have, of talking about some of the disparities that we're seeing. But I think that it's really important to talk about which communities, which populations are experiencing higher levels of substance use disorders, lower levels of housing and supportive services, and just what we can do about some of those health inequities that we're seeing in Arizona, specifically related to addiction and housing. So any one of the panelists that wants to kick it off, I'll turn it over to you.
I'll go. So in Arizona, there's definitely some disparities and inequities in our brown and Black communities in many different aspects. Substance use and substance use treatment, access to treatment is very, very real. There's tons of data around this. In order for us to make that change, I think everybody needs to acknowledge that and believe that it's true. I'm very involved in a lot of these conversations, and it still isn't a widely accepted fact that this is our reality. So I think some of this is people getting on board with this is real, this is happening, and we need to do something about it. People also need to get politically involved, and legislation is in session right now. You sign up for the request to speak system and support various bills that are going through. Outside of that, it's really making sure that the people who do have the influence and the power to make changes are making those changes and are committed to those changes. I think it would be great if agencies would all make an anti-racist statement and commitment that their agency is going to address these disparities and inequities, especially when it comes to race. It just needs to be done. And then when you're serving those communities, they have to be culturally appropriate. One thing that we know from Native American Connections is that our Native family is not going to certain places to seek any kind of help or treatment because they don't trust them or they don't know enough about it. But we know that they go to other places like NAC or Native Health or PIMC because it's very familiar to them. And I think it's very important, especially when we're talking about treatment, we have culturally responsive treatment options for people. People come from all over the world, all over the country. Treatment looks different in different communities. So it's really important that there's these options for people and that there's not just one cookie cutter response to treatment. Like I think John had said that earlier. It's like at NAC, we have talking circles, we have smudging, women can make cradle boards. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that we're doing to meet that need for that culture. And that definitely needs to be widened to all kinds of cultures and belief systems that exist in our world. And it needs to be okay. It needs to be recognized by the federal system. It needs to be recognized by payer sources that these are effective methods of treatment that providers should be able to bill for, and they need to be recognized for their efficacy.
I want to echo Stefanie's kind of statements there, and I'm a good storyteller, so I always have stories. I used to do the cultural competency for our organization, and I used to use this story because in healthcare, one of the most common statements that we'll hear across the board is that, oh, that individual, the reason that they're not successful is because they're not compliant. And I'll tell you, I hear it from nurses, from therapists, from you name it. That's one of the most common reasons that we use for people not being successful in treatment, whether it's physical health, whatever. And so a few years ago, I had an individual who was Spanish speaking only, living, we're right on the border. So he was coming from across the border, and he kind of went back and forth. And so we were providing mat services for this individual. And one of the things that we do is we also follow their physical health. And he had a real problem with hypertension. So we were trying to get him prescribed some hypertension medications. His mindset and the way that he sees life was, I am not taking that poison. You're not going to give me that. Now, he identified, he knew, and he said, I don't have a problem with blood pressure. I just have headaches all the time. Again, couldn't connect the dots. And so it took me sitting down with him at one point, because they were basically like, what do we do with this guy? Because he's being non-compliant. And it took sitting down with him. And after a little bit of conversation with him, he was telling me how he deals with his headaches. Well, he takes a tea from a friend in Mexico that gives it to him, and that's how he deals with his headaches. My question to him is like, what's this tea? I want to know what it is, because maybe I can use it. We built a rapport. We kind of, and over a time frame, we got him on medication over time, but it took time to really sell him on why we were trying to do this with him. But I think that it's real easy for us to say, I have the answer to your problem. I know what you need, and you need to do this. And when they push back because of their cultural differences, we just say, well, then they're non-compliant, and then they can just continue to be unhealthy. And that goes, I mean, this is a real simple analogy for a physical health issue, but this goes across the board for all aspects, whether it's, again, mental health, addiction, the relationships, whatever it is. Stefanie's correct. We have to really come up with solutions that connect with individuals, that can surpass those cultural barriers that we kind of run into, and then we just get stuck there and we say, well, oh well, we tried. And that can't be the answer that we have when it comes to whatever aspect of our services that we're providing. And I think, to answer your question, Serena, I think that's what leads to those inequities in different communities, because we just kind of write them off and we say, well, too bad. We know what they need. They're not willing to accept it. And so they can just suffer. And that doesn't work. It never works. We have to find those ways to overcome those barriers, to identify what they are. How do we really, again, maybe we just need to better communicate with each other, or have a better message or way to really show them how this is valuable to them with their cultural values in mind.
Absolutely. Lots of yeses in the chat as well. So we have an enthusiastic audience. I wanted to get back to an earlier audience question, because I think that I've seen several themes on this about wanting to know what the biggest challenge is for providing housing to individuals with substance use disorder. Is it a lack of available housing units? Is it a lack of funding for wraparound services? Is it difficulty reaching the people in need? And you can answer D, all of the above as well, but I'd love to know each of your perspectives on what the greatest challenge is. And Nathan, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, so in our experience here at Oxford House, really some of the challenges that we've ran into is, one, not being able to expand fast enough to fit the need. We find it very often, we get a house open, it's full. You know what I mean? It's instantly full, and we have the need for another house. So being able to expand, fast enough to meet the need has been a little bit of a challenge. But one that we're slowly and hopefully overcoming, and as COVID starts to slow down. And then another for us is being able to find funding for our members that are coming in. We're a self-governing, self-pay recovery housing option. So, be able to find funding for the members coming out of treatment who are coming out who don't have a job, or don't have the finances to be able to move into, recovery housing off the jump. We've been pretty resilient in being able to find some resources, but it just always seems like it's never enough. We can never find enough help for those that need it. So from, our experience, reaching the people hasn't been too hard of an issue. The need is definitely there. COVID definitely presented some obstacles, with not being able to go into person and show people in the treatment centers and things that, and MAC clinics that were an option, and we're here and we have beds and we want to house you. We definitely overcame that and try to get creative with Zoom and things of that nature. So that hasn't been too terrible much of a problem for us, but I really do think that providing resources and funding to get these people housed is an obstacle that we need to overcome.
And Stefanie and John, what do you say the greatest challenge is?
I mean, always resources, definitely. I mean, if we had more resources, we could do more, definitely. The reality is that, we have to kind of understand that sometimes the resources may be finite, that we may not have everything that we want. I think the better use of our resource, the better using the resources that we do have is going to be key. And that comes to really, we need to, nothing against politicians or policymakers, but I don't think that they get it. I don't think that they know. I don't think that they're bad people. I just think that often they're running with their own understanding and what they know. And we might assume that because they're in that position, they're there because they know what we need them to do. They don't. We need to be vocal. We need to be educating them. We need to be moving them and to get them to understand what the real needs are. One of the frustrations that I have sometimes is I'll see funding come into something and I'm like, who came up with that idea? Why would you put money into that when we haven't used that funding? There's often times when we leave money on the table because it's allocated to very specific, very, things that we can't touch. And we know that we're never going to use that money. And so that money sits there, but it's available. And if we could access it, we would be able to do so much good in these other areas. So I think that really working with policymakers, working with those legislators that are setting these, these policies on how this money is being used, to educate them to how can we really make an impact on that problem that we're trying to solve with the resources that you're going to allocate to us, to really have our voice heard in that arena, I think is going to make the big difference. There's no other, there's nothing else that really can change that other than having our voice heard. Those people that are on the ground doing the work, really being able to share that with those policymakers to make sure that when they do spend the money, they spend it wisely and they allocate the resources that we really need and allocate them in a place that's going to be valuable to us.
I think a lot of major systemic changes would have an impact on this, but that might be a whole other webinar where we need way more than an hour to talk about that. So I think to be specific to this question, definitely I echo everything that Nathan and John have already mentioned. So I think just to add to that, I would also want to talk about the stigma. There's definitely a stigma that comes with people with a substance use disorder. Working with landlords on, not every landlord is understanding that, yes, there's this issue going on. However, we're working on this and we're addressing it. Like, this is not new to us. But not everybody is that understanding. And the stereotyping and the stigma, just perpetuates, and there's not as much protection for leaseholders or renters as there could be when it comes to issues like this. So yeah, without getting too far off the rails, I think some major systemic changes need to happen as well.
Completely agreed. Thanks, Stefanie. So we are getting close to the end of this webinar, which I know has flown by because of the great insights and wisdom of these panelists. So thank you all for taking the time to share your expertise, and we'll wrap up with your final thoughts in just a second here. But I also wanted to certainly thank the Arizona Housing Coalition for co-hosting this webinar discussion with us, and thank the audience for being such active participants and for sharing your great questions and your thoughts in the chat today. And we're just really grateful to all of you for attending. And if you have other topics you'd like us to talk about in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll be sending out a link to this recording so you can just respond to that email if you have follow-up questions or thoughts for future webinar topics. So I'll give a couple of minutes to each of the panelists to give their final thoughts and to share any parting wisdom you might want to give to the audience. So Nathan, do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Sure. First is thank you for allowing me to be a part of this and have a seat at the table to talk about housing with addiction. I think this is a topic that will never get old. It will always be something that we're facing and something that we're trying to overcome. I know Oxford House has definitely seen the need and the importance for housing for those in recovery. Just shortly from 1975 to now, we've grown to over 3,000 houses across the country. And just like I said, within the last couple of years here in Arizona, we've opened up 49 houses. And that should just speak to the volume of how important that housing is for people in recovery. Just a one data kind of point that kind of shows, the benefits of housing for people in those recovery is DePaul University did a study with Oxford House, over 160 studies with Oxford House. And what they found is that 87% success rate for those that stayed within recovery housing or our Oxford houses to achieve long-term sobriety of 5 years or more. I mean, that's the end goal. The end goal is to get people's lives back on track, to get them back to productive members of society, and housing definitely, it plays such a huge role in that. So hopefully, as time goes on, we're able to continue to fight this battle and continue to provide resources and options for those starting the recovery path. And I know Oxford House is definitely here to help with that.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Nathan, and for sharing about the work of Oxford House. Stefanie, I'll have you give your final thoughts.
Well, thanks for having me today and everybody for participating. It's a lot easier to be a panelist when people are engaged and asking questions and really interested. So I would leave on the note that voting is important, being politically active is important, knowing what's going on, because like John said, people making the policies are not always the subject matter experts. We need to be telling them what's going on in the trenches, what we're seeing, what we need. So everybody register to vote, everybody request to speak from the city to the state, it's needed. And after that, I just want to remind everybody that the people that we're serving are people, they're humans, and approach them as so that they're not just an addict, they're not just a homeless person, they're a human being, and we need to treat everybody as a human being and meet them where they are and really listen to what they're telling us. They are the expert in their own lives, and we can just be a catalyst to get them to where they need to go to make that connection. So just I'll leave on that.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for joining us again, Stefanie, and for the great work that Native American Connections does. John, I'll have you give your final thoughts and wrap us up.
All right, so I did see some of the questions on there, like how do we engage in this if we're not involved in mental health, we're not involved. Well, everybody's involved in this, and I know that I think it was a banking person that asked that. One of my, I know I'm really old, so one of my little side things, I was a realtor for about 6 years at one point, and I know that home ownership is one of the most powerful motivators, and there's it's such a empowering thing to individuals in our country. And so I think that even from someone in the banking community, making sure that those policies that your organizations pursue and they promote and that they lobby for, and kind of they promote that well-being for our community as a whole, because when the community as a whole is healthy, it helps other individuals, especially those that are struggling, be healthy also. It's not just about, again, that silver bullet. We need to find that one thing that we need to fix. It needs to be a holistic approach in all aspects of our lives that really makes a difference to our society and to those individuals that we're providing services to.
Thanks, John. Thanks to Community Bridges and for allowing you to join us today and give that perspective from Yuma as well. And once again, I wanted to say thanks to the Arizona Housing Coalition for being our co-hosts here. We've recorded this webinar. You all will get a link to this conversation, and we'll be sure to share some follow-up information from each of our panelists as well, so you can continue to engage with their great work. And thank you all for taking the time to be here today, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Have a great Wednesday, everyone.